I'm not suggesting that globalization is over, and indeed the data doesn't tell us that either. But hyperglobalization is. So as 2022 comes to a close, it's that time of year when analysts like me wheel out their prognostications for the year ahead. My 2023 Global Political Outlook is entitled Firewalking. So why firewalking? Am I actually suggesting that investors and CEOs learn to walk barefoot across hot coals? Definitely not. Do not try this at home. But the title was inspired by the American poet Charles Bukowski, and the phrase from the poem that I took for inspiration was, "What matters most is how well you walk through the fire." Because frankly, at this juncture, we're not going to be able to avoid the complexity and the volatility in the environment ahead of us. We have such a constellation of risk factors never before encountered during our professional lifetimes that we really don't have a map. So what we need to do is something like learn to walk through the fire, and in fact probably develop a little bit of the superpowers needed to do that. And that's what I intend to highlight during the course of this presentation. So how did we get to this state of affairs in a year that was marked by so much geopolitical volatility? Well, the first point is that US midterms didn't do what they normally do, which is give a bloody nose to the incumbent party. President Biden, despite the global challenges of the war in Ukraine, threats of a US recession, higher gas prices, and his Democratic Party, managed to outperform the ruling party in pretty much any modern US election. At the same time, in China, Xi Jinping, who was looking to consolidate his power at the Communist Party Congress, saw unprecedented recent protests, probably the biggest since 1989 in Tiananmen Square, with the zero COVID protests. Giving in to the protesters and relaxing the draconian zero COVID policies in China has been welcomed by the markets for obvious reasons. There's hope that China will return to growth and hope for more consumption in the gas and oil market. But what the change in stance from Xi Jinping also tells us is that the regime really needs to continue to have public legitimacy. And after 3 years of zero COVID, softening those restrictions has been important. Having said that, we shouldn't be surprised if restrictions are again imposed. Looking at the theme in our top 10 list about autocracies cracking, the case in point that I'd highlight is Iran. Iran has been in the midst of several months of protests, initially over women covering their hair, the hijab law, but now something much bigger. But what we're not seeing in Iran, in contrast to China and its relaxation on zero COVID, is any real move to relax the policies that have so enraged young Iranians who form a significant portion of the population. The regime in Iran has been described as grandparents or grandfathers waging war against their grandchildren. The trouble is that the generation of the grandchildren actually outnumber them quite significantly. Those protests in Iran haven't quite reached a turning point or an inflection point, but the choice of the regime to jail and to execute the protesters, including teenage children, is a real warning sign. And that's what I mean when I talk about autocracies cracking. This wave of protests in Iran may not be the end of the regime, but the next one might be. The global response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also been transformational. The sanctions regime against Russia, the reputational risk that has ensued against companies and agents that have been in support of the regime has frankly been unprecedented. Inside boardrooms and behind closed doors, this is something that I'm talking about a great deal because, of course, the fear is that this kind of contagion could spread to doing business with other complex regimes, such as China. So that idea of the sanctions response and the reputational risks associated with engaging with complex regimes, as I like to call them, is something that's going to continue to preoccupy us in the years ahead, because it seems like the goalposts are changing. Venezuela, for example, is now seeing US sanctions against it relaxed. Probably the biggest geopolitical risk at the front of the minds of investors is whether China will move to reunify with Taiwan. In other words, is Taiwan heading for its Ukraine moment? One scenario is that China has a narrowing window to reunify with Taiwan, and another is that it's a risk too big to take right now. My argument would be that we need to consider plausible scenarios, and that what is behind a lot of the policy moves toward Russia are really about China and Taiwan. So let's take these points and link them in with number one on the top 10 list, and that's globalization. So one of the biggest macro questions for all investors and business leaders is exactly what are the challenges for globalization? And here is my short answer. We need to remember that we have been living through, in fact, all of our personal and professional lives have taken place during what has been a period of hyper-globalization. And this is what has led companies to expand, poverty to reduce around the world, and many of us, myself included, to be working and living in different countries than we grew up in. So I'm not suggesting that globalization is over, and indeed the data doesn't tell us that either. But hyperglobalization is. The implications of that are manifold. It means that finding opportunities, finding silver linings, and anticipating volatility is going to preoccupy just about every business leader in the period ahead. Number 7 on our top 10 list is my home country of the UK. Now that we have Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister in number 10, after the rather disastrous leadership of Liz Truss, compared to not lasting as long as a lettuce, is the UK headed for more stability? Probably not. Because the Brexit dilemma remains such an open question, and because the polity in the UK remains divided, we're not going to see resolution of this anytime soon. And fundamentally, that is not great news for business. It heightens the uncertainty. It means that the next election, expected at the end of 2024, is likely to be about Brexit again. And it means that companies are still going to have to try to navigate this thicket of negotiations and regulations. Although the good news is we can probably expect a more constructive relationship between the UK and the European Union. So besides these 10 overarching themes that I've laid out, what else do we need to think about in the year ahead? Elections, of course, are what tend to preoccupy political analysts, although I would argue that there are many other things that we should be thinking about. Mercifully, 2023 isn't likely to feature very many systemically significant elections. We've got big EM elections in Turkey, Nigeria, and Pakistan. But what's really important about 2023 from a political stability or political change perspective is the elections that are coming in 2024. And that is a massive group of systemically significant elections. It includes India, Mexico, South Africa, the European Union Parliament, Russia and Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and of course, the US presidential elections, when we will see just what happens next for Trump, Trumpism, or the political status quo in the United States. On that front, MAGA wing of the Republican Party was dealt a clear blow during the US midterms, but I fully expect former President Trump to run again. And I actually think that Joe Biden will also declare. We're going to have two rather geriatric candidates running for the leadership of the United States of America. Make of that what you will, but I think it's the most likely outcome they're going to be announcing any time now and almost certainly before January.